Hey, welcome to the channel. This is tabmok99. What's going on, guys? Here with me is David Craddock, author of Long Live Mortal Kombat. David, welcome to the channel, and thank you for being here.
Oh man, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
So excited to get into the book, Long Live Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, this was a journey for me that started about 3 years ago, and I've published several other books in that time. But a few years ago, I interviewed a lot of programmers, designers, artists, producers to write a book called Arcade Perfect, which was all about converting arcade games to home platforms. And I got to write about Mortal Kombat for that. In fact, my lifelong love of Mortal Kombat informed Arcade Perfect. I probably wouldn't have written that book if I couldn't have tracked down people to talk about Mortal Kombat games. So from there, I tend to look for entry points into these projects that maybe other game historians haven't explored or haven't explored in full. And for Long Live Mortal Kombat, I decided I not only want to write about how these games were made, and of course Long Live MK is a trilogy. The first book, round one, covers the arcade era of Mortal Kombat games. So I get into the development of those, but I really wanted to also explore the fandom's connection to Mortal Kombat, because Mortal Kombat has been on top of the world. It's also had some really low lows, and the community, the fan community with a K, has kept it going through all that, through almost 30 years as of this October. So my goal was to not only, like I said, write about how these games were made, take you inside Midway and Williams, but also just write about how Mortal Kombat has touched the lives of a lot of members of the community.
Now, I need to give you a huge thanks. Guys, not everybody knows this, but David, you actually gave me a copy of your book. It was a PDF. I loaded up on one of these things. For those of you guys who can't see, this is an e-reader. It loads up PDFs. Right now it's on the loading screen, but I'll show you guys the table of contents in a second. This is a 700-page book. This is really in-depth. I mean, you got some stories out here. Like, I've seen a lot of interviews. I've actually attended a lot of panels. I've done interviews myself. I've saved the old magazines. There's stuff in your book that I've never seen anywhere before.
Yeah, that was my goal. Like I said, I look for paths that other historians really haven't walked or haven't explored in full. And I was really lucky to talk to people such as John Tobias, who really wanted to help me get the accuracy of the story down. Ken Fidesna, former manager at Midway, who gave me access to. He was in high level meetings with Neil Nicastro, who ran Williams and Midway for a long time, and Ken had notes that really only someone at his level would have the information to write, and he gave me access to things such as sales figures, so you can actually chart, here's how well this Mortal Kombat game did compared to this other Mortal Kombat game. And also just members of the community. One of the reasons I wanted you to read an early copy of the book was not only did I interview you for it, and I felt that you should be privy to an early copy, but also I thought, well, Tabmok is maybe the scholar among scholars for Mortal Kombat lore, not just the in-game fiction, but a lot of behind-the-scenes knowledge as well. And I figured, hey, if anyone can help call me out on things that I got totally wrong or almost, but not quite right, it was you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you got a lot of shout outs there. I've seen a lot of friends and familiar faces. I've seen MK Habit Addict. I've seen Dead. I've seen Shock. And then, of course, you cover a lot of fan projects, too, which I'm always very happy with. I love seeing, like, Drew's Ultimate MK3+, Paul's MK2+. You got the MKHD project and why it was canceled. And I'm not going to get into it here, guys, because you got to read the book. But for years, Ed Boon has tweeted out, oh, yeah, someday I got to go into why this MKHD project got canceled and why it didn't work out. You found the answers, and you covered it, and you just share the whole thing, and it was amazing. Like, that's been one of my burning questions for so long. And you got into it. And then I also know that you've been talking to the iBallistic guys because they're doing an MKHD remake using CG. And that one looks like this is actually workable. And I think this is actually going to happen. As long as WB doesn't pull the plug.
I sure hope it happens. That team has been a joy to talk with. But, I mean, yeah, I appreciate everything you just said. I consider it my job as a gaming historian and as a storyteller to bring you well, two things: information you never knew, but also information you knew, but with more light shed on that
Yes,
topic.
more detail. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Look, one of my favorite stories in the book, and then I'm going to ask you what one of your favorite things was you found out, but one of my favorite stories was just something simple, like Acclaim loading up the trucks in Mexico to get them shipped into the U.S. and trying to make that Mortal Monday deadline and cutting it so close. And then I found out there's fast lanes, right? The slow lanes have electronics and other home goods, and then the fast lanes have the food stuff and the perishable items. And so they snuck Mortal Kombat cartridges onto the trucks with lettuce. That way they could use the fast lanes. I mean, stuff like that I thought was amazing.
Yeah, like I said, you know that Mortal Monday was a huge deal for Mortal Kombat. It really made Mortal Kombat a household name. I realized, no one's ever interviewed a lot of the marketers who did Mortal Monday, the founders of Acclaim, who kind of brainstormed Mortal Monday. And I wanted to shed light on those stories and just give you this picture of not only how this campaign for Mortal Kombat 1's release came together, but also supply the context of how that campaign revolutionized video games. I mean, Sonic 2 had Sonic Tuesday when the game had a release date before. And what a lot of people might not know today is games didn't always have release dates.
They just showed up whenever.
They just showed up. The publisher might say, Christmas or this summer. They were kind of vague release windows. But this idea of not only releasing the home version of the game on a specific day, but multiple versions, 4 versions of the same game, and not just in one territory, but all around the world. That was something that no one had ever pulled off before, and Acclaim kind of set the mold for how to do that.
Absolutely. So that was my favorite story. Well, 2 of them, I guess. Why did the MKHD project get canceled, and then loading up the trucks? What was your favorite story that you learned from doing the book?
Well, so like I said, I've talked a lot with John Tobias, and his role in this has been to just supply as much historical context as possible so that I can get the details right. And one thing he shared with me that he'd never shared before was a concept, just a quick sketch of a 7-button control scheme for Mortal Kombat 1. And I guess the thinking he and Ed had there was, well, Street Fighter 2 had 6 buttons. We're going to have 7. We'll have one more. High, low, and medium punches and kicks, and the block button. And I think we can probably agree that probably would have been 1 button too many. It would have been awkward. So paring that down to 5, I think really worked for Mortal Kombat. And it certainly made it more palatable for the 16-bit home systems, which had between 3 and 6 buttons. So 7 would have been 1 button too many in more ways than one.
Okay, that's also my favorite story from the book. I mean, and I remember when you sent me a picture of that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it and share it on the stream or anything like that, but it was amazing. There were 3 buttons on top, right? Like 3 punches on the top, 3 kicks on the bottom, and then a block in the middle. And I could see where they were going with that, but I'm glad they made the choice they did, because the actual final layout is so iconic. It's hard to imagine that it would have been any other way. And you covered other stuff like that in your book too. You covered like an original version of Street Fighter that would have only used 1 single button, and just depending on how hard you press it. Oh, right, well, a punch and a kick. I'm sorry.
For kick. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, close enough, right? It was,
and then you press the button a little bit and it jabs, and you press it hard and it punches super hard. But then I guess the players were damaging the buttons, so they had to get away from that whole idea. But I never knew that before either. Like, this is amazing stuff you got.
Yeah, like I said, I try to dig as deep as possible, and I had a lot of sources of information and arcade ads that I'll get to display in certain editions of the book. So I think that my goal is that not only will Mortal Kombat fans learn so many stories they never knew, but also maybe see themselves in some of the other fans I've interviewed and say, oh, you know what, that's my personal connection to Mortal Kombat as well, and hopefully they'll enjoy that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. No matter how knowledgeable you are about Mortal Kombat, there's always new stuff to learn. I'm learning new things from reading the book. I just thought it was incredible, everything that you found. So having said that, let me read one of the chats. Nick Solo says, what was that thing I heard not too long ago about the MK team working on an SF game? It was a tweet by Ed Boon. Some people thought possible MK versus SF. I'm not sure I know what he's talking about. You know what you aware of that?
No, I'm not sure. I mean, I know that the recent reveal of Street Fighter 6, the art style did make me think, oh, this isn't too far removed from Mortal Kombat's look,
True.
especially Mortal Kombat X and 11. I think Street Fighter versus Mortal Kombat. I know nothing about that, whether it'll happen. I only hope it will happen because I feel like that's one of the few dream video games we haven't seen. I mean, the first big one I would say happened in Super Smash Brothers Brawl for Nintendo Wii when Sonic appeared as a playable character in a Smash Brothers game, and then when Smash Brothers 4 for Wii U and 3DS added Ryu, I thought, oh man, I know Mortal Kombat would probably never get approved by Nintendo. It's too violent, but to have Sub-Zero Scorpion appear to face off against Ken and Ryu in Smash Brothers would be cool. But the next best thing, the very best thing, would be a dedicated Street Fighter versus Mortal Kombat game for sure.
Absolutely. Listen, I loaded up that picture. Hope it's okay with you if I show the 3 punches on the left, the 3 kicks on the right, and the block.
Yeah, sure. And like I said, all credit to John Tobias. He shared that with me.
He did. And I credit you for passing it on to me. So thank you for that. And now it's on the stream.
Well, that was important, right? Because I was like, okay, I want to know if I'm on the right track with this book. I figure if I can show Tabmok something he's never seen, I'm on the right track. And I remember I showed you that, and you were like, what? And I was like, okay, that passed the litmus test. Tabmok didn't know about it, so I'm on the right track with this book.
That's right. All right, let me put it back to us again.
Sure.
So, yeah, little things like that were incredible. And there were so many details all along the way. I don't even know where to begin. It's just, yes, I did read it, guys. It was a 700-page book. I read the whole thing cover to cover. Loved it. And I can't wait for you guys to see it in shelves. And there's not just the regular edition of the book. There's also an Ultimate Edition, right?
Yeah, so Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1, first in the trilogy.
The best trilogies come in threes.
Yeah, that's true. So in true Mortal Kombat fashion, there'll be Round 1, Round 2, and Final Round, because it's got to be 2 out of 3. And Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1, which covers the arcade era, will be coming to Kickstarter on March 22nd, one day before I turn 40. So, come out and support me, Mortal Kombat fans. Best birthday present I could ask for. But there will be two editions of the book. The first, Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1, will be available as an ebook, a paperback, and a hardcover. And that'll be the full story. You won't be missing a thing. But what'll be different about it will be it'll be in black and white, and it won't have any photographs or screenshots. Reason is printing big books, and this is a big one, is very expensive, and it would be more expensive if we would print in color. So I thought, well, maybe we could print black and white photographs, but who really wants to see that stuff in black and white? So there will be a second edition, a little wink and a nod to Mortal Kombat's evolutionary track. There'll be Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1, and then Ultimate Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1, which will be the exact same story. No matter which edition you buy, you get the full story. But the Ultimate Edition will be an oversized book, kind of like a coffee table style book, with full color photographs, screenshots, the works, dozens of these things, all submitted by fans. And that, I think, will be the edition that Mortal Kombat collectors like you will want to have on their shelves.
Oh, people like me will want the bundle. We'll want both editions.
Oh yeah, you'll want both editions, of course, and there will be bundles on the Kickstarter. You'll get the standard and ultimate editions, so you can have each cover, each edition.
And I'm going to show your website right now as you're talking.
Sure. And there'll also be some bundles include a book I'm working on right now, a companion book called Cool Stuff, which is a shout out to one of the cheat menus in the Super NES port of Mortal Kombat 3. That menu, for those who didn't play that version or who have forgotten, was just a secret menu full of options you could enable or disable. And my companion book is basically extra interviews that I didn't have time or space to include in Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1. And actually, you can read Cool Stuff for free online right now at, I think it's davidcraddock.substack.com, which is my newsletter. Like I said, it's free to sign up. And you'll want to sign up if you haven't because not only will you get cool stuff for free online, but you get notifications about the Long Live MK Kickstarter. Yeah, I think that collectors will be really happy with both editions of Long Live MK1 and cool stuff. And we also have some other collectibles planned that'll be part of those Kickstarter bundles, like a bookmark that kind of resembles the string of tickets you take out of redemption games like Skee Ball, numbered arcade tokens that you can place next to your books, and some other things. I don't want to let those cats out of the bag just yet, but I think this Kickstarter will really kind of carry over the theme from the book of the arcade era, what made it magical. And I think Mortal Kombat fans and fans of video games and how they've impacted culture will, just in general, will really find something to love here.
That's really cool. So I was showing everyone your website. The domain that I found just over the weekend is longlivemortalkombat.com. So as soon as I found it, I subscribed, I signed up for the email newsletter. All I had to do was put in my email address and it starts sending me stuff. This morning, before we did the interview, I noticed that you had a new article with, you did an interview with Diamond Select Toys. They were talking about a lot of stuff, but I was interested in the Scorpion and Sub-Zero part, where they said, in the games they were palette swapped, but we took steps to differentiate them. So Scorpion and Sub-Zero looked a little different from each other. I just thought it was amazing the way you go out and you find all these people and get all this stuff to come out that nobody ever knew before. None of the fans knew this stuff.
I think it's just because, and you and I share this in common. When we love something, we're very curious about all aspects of it, and we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about it, and that leads to us coming up with questions that maybe people haven't thought to ask before. And I'm really proud of the first of this 2-part feature with Diamond Select Toys. They've been great working with me. I worked with Zach Oat, one of their marketing managers there, who gave me access to 3 artists. And so this features an oral history. You'll get to hear from Zach on some of the history of Diamond Select Toys. And then we get into, in part 1, the legends in 3D busts of Scorpion and Sub-Zero. And like you said, how the artist and sculptor kind of collaborated to differentiate the characters so that you would feel like buying both busts was worth your time and money. And then in part 2 of my oral history with Diamond Select Toys, we'll get into the making and design of the statue dioramas, and they were very kind enough to send me this Sub-Zero, which is definitely a very cool statue. And like I said, you'll get to read an interview with the artist and the sculptor and just how they made these things look so intricate. My wife and I were looking at this last night. You probably already noticed this, but I love, for example, in his left hand, you can kind of see, I don't know how well it's coming across, but his fingers poking out. Mm-hmm. And then in his right hand, he has like this sickle blade on a shield. But you can also see his hand is really kind of icy colored. The back of his hand is icy colored. Might not come across there, but
it does. It's really awesome.
That's good. Yeah, it's So again, huge shout out to Diamond Select Toys for giving so freely of their time. I think they're happy with how this feature turned out as well. And number one priority for me is the fans. Will the fans enjoy this? And I think fans will really love reading this feature on Mortal Kombat figures.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole book I think is super amazing. What I like is that you captured the game development side of it, and then you also captured the fan, like the community side of it. You interview players and what Mortal Kombat meant to them and where they were at in life when they encountered it and how they got better at it and how they expressed their fandom. It's really incredible. And to me, Mortal Kombat, more than any other video game, has always felt like a conversation, like a back and forth between the creators and the players. And like little things in your book, like how players got mad about throwing and the community looked down at it, and then before you know it, the next update of the game had a throwing disabled code. Or the way they took rumors and made them real, like animalities and stuff like that. Like, to me, you captured both sides of the equation, which I think is very unusual. I think a lot of people, when they do this kind of storytelling, they either talk about the community or they talk about the game developer side, and they don't do both, but you married them together perfectly.
Oh, I appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. And that's like I said, I've written a lot of stories about what happens behind closed doors at game companies, and you will, as you said, you'll get that information, you'll get that side of the story, but you'll also see what happens when Mortal Kombat games are released and how they affected the players who bought them and how that led them to, in many circumstances, standing up to bullies, escaping abusive homes. And led to careers that, because of being able to trace back their interest in their career to Mortal Kombat. And I did that because I kind of wanted to. I didn't go into this with an agenda, but I thought it would be nice to counteract the long prevailing reputation of violent video games as being corruptive to children. Well, in fact, it's just the opposite. I did speak with a leading psychologist about that topic, and got into some research. And there's really just no merit to that. There never has been. It's more of a political scapegoat these days. And I just thought that was one of many very important topics to address.
It is. It
yeah,
is.
because,
I've got a psychology degree too, and that's one of the things that we learned, like in studies on aggression and stuff like that. Like, does playing violent video games make people more violent in real life? And they've never been able to establish that it does. So if you've got people with a vested interest in trying to prove that it's dangerous and they can't prove the danger, that usually means you're safe.
Yeah, and like I said, I went into this with no agenda. I had my beliefs, but I've been doing this long enough that I can be an objective and an unbiased writer. And I was not surprised to learn that there was no merit to the argument that video games can corrupt children. It's really about good parenting. I mean, and I've been playing Mortal Kombat since I was 10. I haven't killed anybody. I don't get into fights. I've never been in a fight in my life. Probably not surprising to take a look at me, but I'm my mom's rule was always, hey, you can play this game. I don't really approve of it, but you can play it. But if you start getting into fights, getting into trouble, or your grades go down, no more Mortal Kombat, no video games. And I was like, well, logically, I want to play Mortal Kombat and I want to play video games, so I'm going to do as well as I can in school and stay out of trouble. And I think I've turned out okay.
Absolutely. So, all right, I've got tons and tons of burning questions that I think only you can answer, having researched this book for, what would you say, 3 years now? You've been working on this one?
It's been, actually, this is just 1 year. From beginning to writing to drafting to looming the Kickstarter campaign looming in March.
Okay, so I'm going to try and stick to the questions that you told me you've already got answers for, but I know there's other stuff that you're going to try and research for me. I might sneak a couple of those in too by mistake, but we'll roll with it. My first question. All right. My favorite video game system that I had before Mortal Kombat was the 8-bit NES. I mean, to me, this was an amazing system, and somehow Mortal Kombat never came out for it, at least not officially. I've got some pirate cartridges and some ROMs, but officially, Acclaim made the decision they're not going to do it. And what drives me nuts about it is they released it on the frickin' Amiga with one button. That system is not qualified to handle Mortal Kombat. It was very frustrating on the Amiga. And why did they decide not to do it on the NES? And at what point did they make that decision at Acclaim?
So I talked to two people about this. The first was Robert Holmes, who is the co-founder of Acclaim Entertainment, and Jeff Peters, who is the project manager at Sculptured Software, and specifically a project manager on Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3, the home versions of those games. So I got both perspectives. Rob's perspective was this, and actually this will be fully explored in an upcoming chapter of the free companion book Cool Stuff in about a week or so, but you get the exclusive. Rob said that in 1991, for the first time since their founding, Acclaim posted a loss. And they were a public company, so that was a problem. So to reassure the shareholders, Rob had to say, hey, we posted a loss because, the NES is really slowing down. Sega Genesis, the 16-bit system, has gained a lot of traction. The Super Nintendo came out in August 1991 here in the States. It had been out for a year or so, I believe, in Japan. As the Super Famicom. So Rob said, we're going to look forward. We're going to focus on 16-bit. So the fact is, Rob said they did talk about an 8-bit port of Mortal Kombat for the NES, but as a public-facing company, it was their responsibility to say, we're done with that hardware. We're focusing on 16-bit. And sure enough, as we know with Mortal Monday, they made just astronomical sales on the 16-bit versions of Mortal Kombat. Now, that might lead to a follow-up question, a very logical one. Well, the Sega Master System was 8-bit, and it got a port of Mortal Kombat. Why?
But it was still a profitable system, at least in Brazil.
So that's the thing. That's exactly what Rob said. They said, Master System had not really slowed down that much in Brazil and other European territories. but where the NES had never gained nearly as much traction for a lot of reasons. The hardware was expensive, and the Master System, even in the face of the Mega Drive, known here as the Genesis, Master System was still posting strong numbers. But there was another benefit. For Arcade Perfect, I spoke to the engineer who ported Mortal Kombat to the Master System.
Right.
And Master System games were very easy to port to Game Gear, which
Yes.
was new and was posting strong sales. So that's why there was a Game Gear version, because really that game, I don't want to trivialize it, there was a little bit more involved in it, but essentially all this engineer had to do was take the Master System version's code, change the dimensions, because the screen was smaller, and put it on Game Gear. And like I said, a little more complicated than that, but not much. And so really the bottom line is it made sense to do Master System versions for that console and Game Gear, but the NES Acclaim had to leave that behind. And also, here's Jeff Peters' perspective. Jeff, Sculptured Software is interesting. A lot of people might not know this, but even though they had experience with other platforms such as the Genesis, they were widely known by their peers in the industry as the Mode 7 company. Companies like Nintendo and Konami used Mode 7 in games like Mario Kart, F-Zero, Super Castlevania 4, but Sculptured Software made excellent use of it. You probably saw it in the Super Star Wars trilogy, but also, I can't think of the name right now, but there was a college basketball game that Sculptured Software did with Mode 7 that was basically a 3D game. It used the same perspective that would come to be popularized with the rise of 3D, or I'm sorry, not 3D, but 32-bit consoles like the PlayStation. And despite that, Jeff Peters said, it took us a long time to master the Super Nintendo and Genesis. The NES was so difficult to use technically. You had 4-color sprites, you had very limited backgrounds. He said it would have required a whole design workaround to accommodate for 2 buttons. And remember, Probe did the Master System and Game Gear ports, so they had to deal with that as well, shrinking 5 buttons down to 2, really 3 with Start. But Jeff said,
they had to make the 6-button edition too, because Genesis had that.
Exactly. So Probe already had a lot of hoops to jump through. And
True.
Jeff said, like Acclaim, we were kind of looking to the future. We were working on 16-bit hardware. It just didn't really make any sense to us to go back and do NES. So at Sculptured, it was really not even under consideration. But at Acclaim, they did talk about it. But a variety of factors, all financial, just made them say, no, got to move forward.
Fair enough. I do have a question, and you probably don't know this one, but maybe you could find out, because it's not related to Acclaim or Midway. But the Jungle Book came out on the NES in 1994. I'm wondering if that was a profitable game or if they made a loss on that one.
I'd have to check, because it's not like all companies abandoned it. There were certain properties that would sell well no matter what. Remember, Mortal Kombat did well in arcades, but a lot of people didn't know how it would do at home because of the controversy around the violence.
Yeah.
Now, Disney, those games are going to sell because, at this time, really before Mortal Kombat, here's another thing Mortal Kombat revolutionized. Before Mortal Kombat, most publishers took Nintendo's stance on video games is that, they're toys. These are mostly for kids. Mortal Kombat was the game, and that led to the founding of the ESRB, and made people realize, okay, games can be mature. Older players enjoy these as well.
Right, in the way that movies can be mature.
Yes, exactly. So, also another publisher, Capcom put out Mega Man 6 in 1993. Now, it didn't sell as well as 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but that's because it was the 6th one. And also, yes, the NES was running out of steam, but they felt more confident in that because they knew Mega Man players who still had an NES would be all for it.
Okay, so I want to jump tracks now to the Game Boy and the Game Gear editions.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the screenshot of the character select screen for both consoles right now. Somehow, they had different versions, like different characters. The Game Gear got Johnny Cage. The Game Boy got Kano. There was only enough space to fit 6. It was the same company doing it, so I'm a little confused. Why didn't they just keep the characters consistent across all the ports? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So for Mortal Kombat 1, remember the mobile, the handheld platforms, Game Boy and Game Gear, were still relatively new.
Yeah, it's still popular.
Still popular, but still new to programmers, and that's what's important. The longer you work with a piece of hardware, the better you get to know it, and you're capable of doing things after 2, 3, or 5 years of working with this under your belt than you are at the beginning. That's why in video games we tend to see a lot of the best console games near
At the end
end
of the life cycle.
Console's life cycle, because yeah, the programmers just know so much more about the hardware than they did X years earlier.
They figured out all the tricks.
That's why there were exactly. So that's why there were 6 characters in Mortal Kombat 1, but only 8 out of 12 in Mortal Kombat 2. Now, as far as who made those decisions, that would have been John Tobias and Ed Boon. They had the final say on any and all things Mortal Kombat. Huh. And even though there were instances where maybe they were railroaded or people kind of circumvented them to get done what they needed to get done, they would have been the ones to say, okay, well, you can leave, Kano out of this version, but you can put him in this version, but take Johnny Cage out of the other version. Same with Mortal Kombat 2. Acclaim told me that. Sculptured and programmers told me that, and John Tobias told me that in our interviews as well. So
isn't it great when you hear the same story from 2 different people?
Yeah, always got to cross.
That doesn't always happen, though, does it?
Cross-reference. Got to cross-reference. So yeah, that would have been their call.
Okay, amazing. So then I assume it was the same thing again in MK2 when they actually were consistent this time. The same characters in the Game Boy were also in the Game Gear. I mean, the character select screen even follows the exact same layout this time.
Yeah, that was probably just because, Mortal Kombat 2 had more palette swaps, 3 male ninjas, 2 female ninjas. So that, when I talked to these programmers, they said you always choose palette swap characters first because you can fit more of them into memory than you can unique sprites. And they probably just said, instead of having to make players choose between versions, and because we know more about the hardware, let's just keep the rosters the same across the board.
Absolutely. Any insight as to who made the cut and who didn't? Like, why would they say, yeah, Jax makes it in, but Baraka doesn't? Was that based on popularity of the characters, or what do you think was the thought process there?
That might have been based on the popularity of the characters. I'll have to run that by some people, but I feel like, just as John and Ed decided to keep Sonya and Kano out of Mortal Kombat 2 because of a machine they audited. Now, that was, of course, a machine in their area. Elsewhere, we know that Sonya and Kano were very popular, just depended on the region.
Yep.
But they might have just decided, hey, for character diversity, these are maybe the ones we consider the most unique. But I do remember I had Mortal Kombat 2 on Game Gear before I played the 16-bit versions, before I had a 16-bit system. And I really wanted Baraka because I think he was a lot of people's favorite character, just in terms of his design, his visual. I was like, man, I want to play Baraka, but I got it for Super Nintendo, was able to do that. But that would have been, I believe, John's and Ed's decision as well.
Okay, so MK Jasper is asking a question, keeping in theme with the portable MKs. Do you know why MK3 for Game Gear was created and released in other countries, but not in the U.S.?
Yes, I do.
Oh, what happened there?
So that was also, I talked to Jeff Peters about that because, like I said, Jeff Peters was a project manager on Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 for Super NES, and then also Mortal Kombat 3 when Sculptured actually did both 16-bit versions and the PlayStation version of Mortal Kombat 3 as well. Jeff told me that the Game Gear, as we remember, it really didn't live long here in the States. It died very quickly because I had one of those things. I remember I got it on a Christmas day, and within like 40 minutes, the batteries died. And my dad was pretty pissed, not at me, but he was like, well, I bought my son a portable system for Christmas, and the batteries don't even last an hour.
Yep.
So the next day when stores opened, he took me out and we got the AC adapter. That's how I played Game Gear. I had to play it near an outlet because the battery life was just negligible.
They should have made a TV adapter for that thing. I don't know why they didn't.
They should have, especially I feel like they could have figured that out, considering again it was derived from the Master System to begin with.
And there are modders who have actually pulled it off and done it. I'll show you something about that later. It's amazing that people have actually made it happen, but officially there's no way to do it.
And I bet officially, just because everything with public companies comes down to cost and perception from shareholders, they probably, Sega was reeling from the Game Gear, and the Sega CD and 32X didn't do well, so they probably thought financially it's not worth the time or energy to do a TV adapter.
They were doing a lot of add-ons. They were doing a lot of add-ons with the game, with the Sega CD, the 32X, and if you had them both, you could get the 32X CD. But meanwhile, Nintendo did the thing, well, hey, we've got a Super Nintendo, we've got a Game Boy, let's just make a Super Game Boy. Now you can use them both.
Yep.
What do you think that did for their sales? Do you think that made Game Boy like more of a profitable system for them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there were people who probably wanted to play Game Boy games, but had, by the time Super Nintendo came out, when did Super Game Boy come out? Like 93, 94. The Game Boy was 4, 5, 6 years old. But the idea of, being able to play Game Boy games in color, well, that's a whole new ball game. So you'd probably want to play that, even if you didn't have a Game Boy. But to go back,
yeah, that could actually get people into it for the first time.
Exactly. Like, I mean, Pokemon comes out. Maybe you sold your Game Boy years ago, but you have that Super Game Boy there, so that's nice. But to go back to MK Jasper's question, the Game Gear was still profitable in certain territories. So Sculpture did make that, but they didn't sell it here because by that time the Game Gear had been abandoned. It just didn't make fiscal sense to do it. So it released in Europe, but just never came here because it wouldn't have sold well.
Yeah, but it's cool that, we could import it. There's always that option.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me ask you about another one. I've got a magazine scan here showing an ad for Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 Duo for Sega Saturn. And obviously this never saw the light of day, but it must have come close if they're putting it in the magazines. And I know there's a couple other canceled ports too, and we can get into that, but this one was interesting to me. The most interesting just because it was in print. They were getting people hyped about it. What can you tell us about the MK1 and 2 Duo, which actually did come out for PC and Game Boy?
So that's another, I know this might get kind of old, but it came down to marketing dollars. The Sega Saturn, most people know it was a failure, but they don't know the extent. Here's a true story. Sega announced the Saturn at, I believe it was E3, or it was a summer CES, but in either case, the CEO said, hey, the Sega Saturn is coming. Oh, wait, it's out right now. And you'd think that would be a cause for joy, like, oh, well, there's a new Sega console, I can go get it. Well, here's the thing. Retailers weren't given a heads up. So retailer CEOs are watching this announcement and going, we don't have that. You had angry customers coming to stores demanding the Saturn only to find out, well, we don't have it. Oh, but Sega said you do. Well, they didn't ship it to us. So retailers hated the Saturn from the get-go. They despised that system, and it never really gained traction. So there were a lot of projects, and Jeff Peters talked to me about this as well. There were a lot of projects, Mortal Kombat ports among them, that kind of died on the vine because the systems died on the vine too. The Saturn never really gained any foothold here. It also didn't help that Sony's rollout of the PlayStation was beautifully done, and it just steamrolled everything, including Nintendo for a while. Why did it come out on Game Boy? Because remember, Game Boy never really slowed down until like 96, 97, and then Pokemon came out, gave it another shot in the arm.
Same thing with MS-DOS, right? Like the PC games, yes, they never died out either.
Exactly. I mean, it's absurd how long the Game Boy stayed in production from Nintendo. But those games sold. And now it's kind of the same thing we see today, where a game will come out on a system, and then after it's so old and it's sold so many copies, it'll come out, but at a reduced price under a greatest hits label or something. That's basically what the Duo was. It was kind of a, hey, buy one, get a second for the same price sort of thing. And that made sense because Game Boy was still a hot commodity.
Absolutely. Okay, so Jasper comes up with all the great questions, so I didn't have anything prepared for this.
Oh, hey, props to Jasper. I've been using a lot of his photos in the book, so it's great to hear from Jasper.
There we go. All right, well, I've got a photo from him right now. Let me just resize it here. But I've got a magazine scan that Jasper actually sent me from the Netherlands. So this is the biggest piece of evidence we have for the canceled PC port of Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. And I guess you can't see it on your screen, but if you have it open in a separate YouTube window, you probably could. Basically, we've got screenshots and we've got pics, and on one of the menus it says like, oh, we'll press F12 to do this, so we know it's a PC port. Do you have any inside information on what happened with this one?
I don't really yet, and I can see it here. This is something I'm going to be covering in Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 2.
Yes.
I got to a point where I wrote this where it was so long that I had to think about printing realities with page counts and so forth.
Yeah.
And I said, you know what? And also, it kind of thematically it made sense.
It was 700 pages already.
It was 700 pages, but also thematically, I thought, well, you know, Long Live MK Round 2 is going to be all about the home-only games. Mythologies was a home-only game. So was Trilogy, but I snuck it into Round 1 because it was really the third iteration of MK3, so it made sense.
It does.
Yeah, but really, I don't have information on ports of Mythologies right now, but that's something I'd be happy to look into, because it is, I probably would have preferred that. I didn't have, again, you know how it is when before you're old enough to get a job and make your own money, your parents buy you video games and you have to decide, okay, which console am I gonna back here? I was the Nintendo 64 guy. I didn't really want Mythologies for N64. I played it on a friend's PlayStation because, you know, you didn't have cutscenes. It was just still images.
Yeah, the PlayStation one was better.
Yeah, it was. But I was also a PC guy. I played Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3 on PC even before I played them on home consoles. So I totally would have jumped on Mythologies for PC.
Yeah, would have been a good one.
Yes.
Would have been a good one. Okay, let me go through a couple other ones here. I know you have an answer to this. I don't know what the answer is.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I've got the character select screen up right now for Mortal Kombat 2 for Super Nintendo, showing Johnny Cage wearing a red outfit. Like, okay, he's supposed to wear a blue outfit. They swapped it to red. But if you go back even further, and if you look at screenshots that were published in EGM, you can see that not only was Johnny Cage wearing red, but Jax was wearing blue. So they had like the mirror match costumes. I remember reading your first book, Arcade Perfect. I remember reading how they went through line by line and they made it like exact. And I'm like, okay, so how did this palette swap issue happen? There's another issue too where all the fighters are in danger. Like you can see their life bar is in danger the entire match. That's up here. So
yeah.
You're a programmer. In addition to being an author, you write books and you write code. So you could probably uniquely qualify to say what went wrong here. What were the issues that they ended up ironing out most of them?
Sure. So yeah, just a little bit of background. I've been programming since I was 10, and before I decided to throw my hat in the ring and become a professional writer and make a lot less money than I would have as a professional programmer, I did a lot of coding. It's something I still dabble in, although I don't have nearly enough time for it these days, which is a good problem to have. But so here's the deal. Sculptured Software and the contractors Probe hired, they did do a one-to-one conversion of the arcade code to home versions because, you know, Midway and Ed and John were kind enough to give them the code. That didn't always happen. A lot of times, you know, arcade developers would see home console developers as competition. So they said, oh, you're on your own. You'd have to actually go to arcades and study the game to kind of create a facsimile.
Reinvent the wheel, basically.
Yeah. But in this case, here's the thing. The arcade games were written in assembly. I've actually seen their code. And at that time, home console games, a lot of them 8 and 16-bit definitely were written in assembly as well. But there are different dialects of assembly. So there were times when a certain statement or command in the arcade code would not have lined up with the dialect used by, say, the Super Nintendo. So in that case, they would have had to make small changes. You'll also know that the hardware can be limiting. For example, in the arcade, if you get up close to someone, not close enough to do like a backhand or a headbutt, but close enough to do a flurry of high punches, there's no slowdown. On the Super Nintendo, there is. It's because it didn't have its graphics processing and its core system memory really weren't up to snuff. The Sega Genesis was faster. Blast processing was a marketing buzzword, but it was also kind of real at the same time. There was no such slowdown. Yeah, there was no such slowdown in the Genesis port of MK2. That, you know, those little changes would have come from two things. They would have come from little differences in the dialect of assembly used. But also, here's the thing. You can take a piece of code that says, okay, I need you to grab the sprite in this memory register. But if the artist or the programmer puts the wrong sprite in the right memory register, say the different version of a character's costume, the code will still work.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
What it's supposed to do. You know, you could say, oh, hey, the scissors are in the junk drawer, and you might grab a plastic kindergartner's pair of scissors. It's still a pair of scissors. It's just not the right pair. that's kind of what happened.
You said
there.
to look for the sprite. I found the sprite. Your fault if you put the wrong color there.
Yeah, like I found a sprite where you told me to look. It's just not the right sprite.
I love the analogy. I feel like everybody can understand exactly what you mean, whether you're a coder or a non-coder. That makes perfect sense. Thank you for that one.
Oh, you're welcome. That's actually the thing that programmers learn. The first thing you should do. Some people use a flowchart. I don't, because designing the graphics of a flowchart, I feel like eats up too much time. But there's something called pseudocode, which is basically you kind of talk out or write out your program's logic in your native language so that it kind of makes sense, and then you translate it to code. And that's the other thing. Your other question about being on danger the whole time, that was probably a snafu in the code where there was something that said, oh, flash the danger icon the whole time. They had to go back in and correct that. And you see alpha versions, that's the time when you're like, okay, we have it up and running, now we need to go in and fix things. Like,
I thought about something else as you were talking. From your first book, actually, you mentioned that there were issues with the text and putting it in front of the life bar, and it was just too many layers, so they had to move things around in order to make it all work. I wonder if in the process of moving things around like that then they screwed up the danger thing, and so then they had to fix that too.
It's very possible. And there are other things, for example, so this is a good one. You'll notice that in the Super Nintendo port of Mortal Kombat, or let's start with the arcade, finish him starts as small text, but then it enlarges. Finish him, and then recedes. Super Nintendo could have done that, probably with Mode 7.
Yep.
But instead, what the programmer chose to do, you'll notice that it kind of slides down.
Yes.
Slides back up. Also, fatality, the blood doesn't like run and wriggle. It's static.
Yeah.
That's just because they have to cut sprites.
Fewer sprites, yes.
If you're a programmer and you only have so much space to work with, what's more important? Audio samples, character sprites, or an animated fatality graphic?
Of course, yeah. They had to cut corners on a couple things to fit it all into the cartridge. Makes total sense.
Exactly.
And, that was another thing. You're talking about audio samples and stuff like that. A lot of those audio samples in the arcades, like from reading your book, it makes so much sense. Those sounds, like the "get over here," all that stuff was engineered so that it would cut above the din of the arcade, and you would hear it loud and clear over the other arcade game sound effects. And
exactly.
For a home system, that's not really your biggest concern. When you make sounds, you just make sounds just to, because you need some sounds. It has to sound like something. But in arcades, there was a very specific purpose. Like, there's just so many little details about game development that you don't even think about until, reading the book. It makes total sense.
Yeah, that's what I hope to cover. Because again, this sort of thing, it was a passion project of mine. I was the kid with the magazine who would compare and contrast screenshots from each version, and I wasn't trying to think which one is better. I just cared about why are they different. And now as an adult, I could learn that, and I wanted to share the information.
Yeah, there's technical reasons behind that. Like all of those choices that they made, there's a logic to it, and the programmers did what they had to do to make it work with that particular hardware. It's amazing.
Exactly.
Okay, so I know you are going to talk to the Arcade 1-Up people, I think, later today.
Yeah, we still have, that's like an hour away, so.
Oh, okay. Well, my next question is actually about them, so I wanted to give you a quick little reminder. How did this happen? The MK2 Supreme one, like with the clothing company? What is that about?
That's what I'm going to have to ask them. It's actually, I have so today's conversation with Arcade 1-Up will be kind of a meet and greet. I worked with them before. I got some of their origin story in Arcade Perfect Chapter 9, I believe.
Yep.
But today, they actually, the reason they agreed to do this was I gave them a sneak peek at the Diamond Select feature, and they said, that's awesome. We want to do that with Mortal Kombat for our product as well. So that's what kind of made that happen. And this is on my list of questions to ask them when I get the interview set up.
Just so you know, there is other stuff like that. It's not just the MK2 Supreme. They did one with NBA Jam where it's tied to Chinatown Market. I'm looking at this. I'm like, this is such a weird combination. And also, I know you said Ed Boon's he's got to sign off on all this stuff. Did he?
Well, not anymore. Not anymore. Because remember now, Ed really, and nothing against Ed, he's a cool guy, but WB.
Oh, yeah. Right. In the Midway days. In the Midway days, Ed was the head honcho. Now at WB, they might do things. They might go over his helmet, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering, like, how did such a crazy combination happen? And they've done it with multiple games with other clothing companies. So, yeah, that might be a fun thing for you to explore either today or at some point once you're, with them a little bit more.
Definitely.
Jasper has another question about MK Nitro, which, if you think about it, there's kind of two MK Nitros, right? There's the souped-up version of the MK1 port for Super Nintendo that James Fink you covered in the book. That's what Jasper's question was. Is it covered in the book? Yes. But then there was like Ed Boon's joke about MK Trilogy Nitro Edition for his website. I don't think that one made it into the book. At least not the version I read.
No, I've never heard of that before. There are all these projects. There are probably a ton of projects that never saw the light of day, and that's the thing. I can only chop down so many trees.
I know.
As you talked about. That's where cool stuff comes in. That's why I'm writing a companion book so that you can find out even more stuff about Mortal Kombat. There. To answer that question from Jasper, there is an entire chapter about MK Nitro, and I interviewed not only James Fink about that, and about a lot of other subjects. He had some really fun, wild stories about the arcade days in New York, but also, I talked to Jeff Peters and Sculpture to get their perspective, to get Acclaim's perspective on Nitro and why it ended up not happening. So there's an entire chapter devoted to that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Okay, I think you told me you haven't been able to find this one yet, but I'm just going to ask anyway. It's about Mortal Kombat 2 on the Sony PlayStation, and it was a Japanese-only release. And this is another one of those things that just baffles me. It's like, wait a minute. MK2 was more popular here than it was in Japan. How did it work out to where MK2 on PlayStation 1 is a Japanese exclusive? And I thought PS1 was still kind of popular at this time, too.
Yeah, it's weird. The PlayStation was still popular in a lot of territories, but then you get down into granular subjects such as, well, which version of software is more popular here or there. Japan had never really gotten a good version of Mortal Kombat 2, because remember that we've seen this with the Xbox over the years, but any American-made products were very hit or miss in Japan.
Right.
Japan was fiercely loyal to Nintendo and Sony, not only because they'd been around in the video game business longer than Microsoft, but Microsoft was an American-made console that really did not make sense for Japanese people. Houses there, it's an island. Real estate is smaller. Remember the size of the Xbox and the Duke controller? Putting that in a Japanese person's home, that was ridiculous. In fact, I wrote on Shack News, you can call it's called Bet on Black. It's an entire book about Microsoft's history as a PC games publisher leading into the release of the original Xbox. They actually, like Microsoft of Japan, kind of went into business for themselves. They're like, we don't want to carry the Xbox, even though Microsoft US, the headquarters, was saying, hey, this is your console too. You need to support it. And they said, no, it doesn't make any sense for our consumers. Look how big this controller is. Japanese people are also smaller than most Americans. They have smaller hands. The Duke would cause them hand pains. That's why the Controller S was made, and they just sold it everywhere else because the controller was ridiculed everywhere, but specifically in Japan. So that brings us to Mortal Kombat. There was I believe it was Taito that released the original Mortal Kombat in arcades in Japan.
Yes, I saw that, and I only learned that within the last year. I saw the Japanese MK1 arcade machine with the Taito name on the side. I'm like, what in the world?
Yeah, so I included, there is a flyer, a high-res flyer in the Ultimate Edition of Long Live MK Round 1. But also Mortal Kombat 2, this actually, this crosses off another one of your questions. You'll remember that in the Super NES version of MK2 in Japan, the blood was green, and during fatalities, it went to black and white.
Yep.
That was censorship. Nintendo they let blood into the American version because American consumers wanted that. Remember, Mortal Kombat was an American-made game, and so it kind of gelled with our cultural sensibilities at the time. But in Japan, it was kind of a step too far. And Nintendo has still kind of always been on the fence. I mean, if you remember Resident Evil 2 for Nintendo 64, you could change the color of the blood. It could be red, but it could also be blue or green if you felt it was too violent otherwise.
Oh, I didn't know that about. Yeah, good point.
So it's funny, too, because that game used static background. So if there was a static background with someone's throat ripped out and blood everywhere, that blood was still red.
Right.
But hey, at least the blood leaking out of the zombie you just killed was blue or whatever. But because of that, I don't know this for certainty, but my educated guess is that Mortal Kombat 2 on PlayStation made sense because the Japanese audience never really got a good version of Mortal Kombat 2. And the PlayStation version was, I believe, arcade perfect or close to it, except for loading time.
Yep.
And that would have been something appealing there. Whereas here, we were kind of focused on Mortal Kombat 3 onwards, and that game sold so well on PlayStation here that it didn't really make a lot of sense for Williams Entertainment at the time to go back and put Mortal Kombat 2 on PlayStation, a physical version. However, Mortal Kombat 2 did come as a digital-only release for PlayStation 2, and that did so well because it was cheaper to make and cheap to sell.
Now, let me take this back to something you said earlier, because MK2 was released on the Sega Saturn, but you said that the Sega Saturn was an abysmal failure. Was it a failure in Japan as well?
It was probably less of a failure, but even by then, remember, PlayStation Mania was taking over. So right. PlayStation really kind of stepped into Nintendo's foothold as the number one video game company in Japan. So here's the funny thing. I couldn't fit this into Long Live MK, but it will come up in cool stuff. I actually talked to a marketer from Acclaim who was in charge of the Saturn version of MK2, which I believe came out a year later, 95. And he kind of felt very discouraged because, at least as he remembered it, he was really the only person at Acclaim who seemed to be excited about Mortal Kombat 2 on Saturn. So I asked Rob Holmes, and Rob said, you know what, like I know who said that, and nothing against him, but he was probably right. We had lost the Mortal Kombat license. We did have the rights for certain home versions of 1 and 2 because they'd originally released those. But for us, we were kind of looking forward to other franchises. They had NBA Jam. Rob was working on the Turok license because Turok comics were taking off. So he said, as far as like Mortal Kombat 2, well, we felt we kind of gave our all for Mortal, was it Tuesday or Friday, for MK2, the 4 main versions of that. And the other versions were just kind of gravy. We didn't, we put some marketing resources into them, but nowhere near the push that we did because that was the first push. It had to make a huge splash, and it did. Mortal Kombat 2 was the best-selling video game in the world for about 2 months until Donkey Kong Country came out in November '94.
Yep.
But that they wouldn't have been able to repeat that because, by that time the game was a year old, and a lot of people who wanted to buy it already had it on one of the systems they had at the time.
Yeah, and that kind of mentality, it just shows you things change really fast. The world goes really fast. You got to move. You got to strike while the iron's hot, and if you wait too long, maybe you better not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I just love the way you have all this background context. You talk about what's going on in the gaming world, and you have what's going on with the consoles, and that sort of plays into what the Mortal Kombat team should or shouldn't do. It's really amazing the way you pull from all these different things and tie it all together. I wanted to ask you a question. Okay, MK3, right? Acclaim had just lost their contract with Midway. They had like the right of first refusal, so Acclaim couldn't do MK3. Midway just decided, hey, we're going to do it themselves, and they purchased Trade West out in Dallas, and that became like Midway Dallas, and they ported MK3 going forward. And then somehow, and you cover this in the book, some of the guys at Acclaim who were responsible for porting the old MK games formed their own company, Avalanche, and they happened to bump into the Midway guys, and now they're like, hey, you know what? Why don't we do MK Trilogy? We kind of already know what we're doing here. Mm-hmm. Little things like that seemed like it was based on a bunch of coincidences. Coincidence with a K. I love that story in your book. That was like another one of my favorite things that you made that come out.
Yeah, I love those stories too. One thing you learn when you work in the video game industry or you cover it, and again, I've done both, it's really small. For as big as it is now, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Networking is super important, which is why there were some questions you have that I haven't been able to answer yet because I have people willing to talk, but they're under NDAs that last literally a lifetime. They sent me copies of their NDAs and I could see in black and white. Oh yeah, this is lifetime, which is, you probably can't enforce that in court. It's legally unfair.
You just also have to wait for them to come down with a terminal illness or something, and then they'll violate it. Exactly.
But I mean, it's one of those things where it's like the last thing I want to do is force someone to talk or jeopardize their livelihood. But I'm still
right. We want the details, but not at that cost.
Not at that expense, right? But there is. I am working on getting around that because I've had to deal with it before. So maybe eventually.
Yeah, I guess you have to talk to the higher ups and say, hey, can you release him from this NDA just for me?
Well, the thing, so I'm talking about the Ultimate MK3 port for iOS specifically.
Yeah, how did that whole deal happen with EA and everything? That was another crazy one.
So that's the thing. I can't get into the particulars, even though I know some of them.
Oh, gotcha,
And the thing
gotcha.
is, like, this is an example of where NDAs don't make any sense. That game is almost 12 years old.
It's not even in the App Store anymore. You can't get it even if you wanted to.
Exactly. The technology used to do it is out of date and wouldn't really hurt any of EA's future projects. And I can list several more reasons that, the NDA doesn't make any sense, but you still kind of have to abide by it. And I do,
Right.
until I can hopefully legally get permission to talk about this one product.
I hope so, because I've got a lot of questions about that port too. Like, why did it not come out for Android? I mean, I guess Android was not that well established yet. I kind of get it. Why didn't it last that long in the App Store? Maybe you can share that one. Why did they have to pull it down?
Yeah, that I know was a licensing deal, which has happened before. There were arcade ports of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the first game, arcade game, and then kind of a remaster of Turtles in Time that the license holder at the time lost it. Nickelodeon has it, and they just haven't re-released them yet, essentially. But that sort of thing happened with Mortal Kombat as well.
That's a shame. I mean, for gamers, like, if just your favorite port of your Ninja Turtles game and your favorite port of your Mortal Kombat game, you can't do it. That port was actually all right. It wasn't perfect, and I'm actually really excited about what Eyeballistic is doing with the MKHD project, and I think it's going to be more arcade accurate. But still, that port was good for what it was. I mean, they got Motaro working with four legs. Like, that's a hard thing that a lot of developers have just decided, we're not putting Motaro in, or if we do, we're not giving him four legs because he's just too hard to work with. The iPhone port was like, yeah, bring it on. We got this.
Yeah, it was. Remember, technology back then probably played a factor in that. Eyeballistic can do it because you can have a lot more polygons on screen now than you could then.
Right.
And but yeah, I agree with MK Jasper. It's a shame that the UMK3 for iOS was taken down, because that was kind of really the first remaster of UMK that we've seen, and it was interesting just for that perspective. I didn't really like playing it because of the touch controls, but it's still a curious artifact that I would like to explore.
I'm kind of with you on that. I got some Bluetooth gamepads, and I was hoping that I could pair it with the game, and it just didn't work out. But here's the thing: if they had released that on Android could have made gamepads work for it, because they have this thing where if you take a Bluetooth controller, you can map it so that this button equates to a button press on exactly this part of the screen. So it's like, okay, I can map this button to low punch, this one to low kick. You could have made Ultimate MK3 on the phone way more fun by making an Android port of it.
Oh, I know. And I know that back then, I'll have to make sure this is accurate, but I remember that in 2010, the App Store was actually, at the time this came out, it was maybe a year and a half to 2 years old. So mobile gaming hadn't kind of swept through the industry yet.
Right. Gamers are still a little unsure about it.
They were. And the problem with Android is it's always been more open, but it's been less stable than iOS.
Naturally.
And so
because you've got a lot of low-end Android phones, and the game's not going to work on those. So when you put something in the store, you just piss people off if it's not compatible with your device.
And then you have to deal with returns, and it's a whole thing.
It is.
But the App Store was really the first time that a mobile platform had stability, but also kind of a centralized storefront. And since Apple handled everything, that's why a lot of publishers supported it. They're like, oh, Apple's going to take care of a lot of the heavy lifting. We can just publish the game and put out updates. That's nice. Android at the time, I believe, required a lot more effort, and it just took longer to catch on.
Makes sense. Somewhat related to this, I think this was EA also. There was like a Java port right around the same time, even though Java was really on its way out. You know what I'm talking about? Did you have any talks with anybody about that?
I haven't talked with anybody about that, and I'm not as familiar with it. That's the thing. That time period was so interesting because there were ports of games appearing everywhere. I mean, so here's an example. Quake 3 was released originally for Windows in 1999. In 2010, John Carmack, just because the guy's a genius and just wanted to see if he could do it, he made Quake Live, which was initially just a plugin for a browser. You went from something that you had to buy on disk to a simple plugin for a web browser. There were all sorts of experiments like that happening. So I'm not surprised to hear that someone was screwing around with a Java port of Ultimate MK3, and I'd love to dig into that as well. I'll have to look into it.
I'll have to look into some of my old files because I remember I got that up and running in a Java emulator on Android, which in turn was running on an Android emulator on my PC. So I could technically live stream the Java version of Ultimate MK3.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's fun to try. There are probably all sorts of those unofficial ports out. There were back then, but now, of course, ROM hacking is this thriving community, and so there are all sorts of ways to play these games that don't have to go through official channels.
The ROM hacking stuff is amazing. I even saw you posted a video on your YouTube channel the other day of MK1, the Arcade Perfect one for Sega Genesis. That guy is amazing.
Yeah, so I got to interview that 4-person team. It's in Cool Stuff.
I had a feeling you're gonna have to update your book for this one.
Yeah, that'll be in Cool Stuff. You'll be able to get it physically on the Kickstarter, or read it for free online. But that was the whole motivation for me ever since I was a kid. Maybe you felt the same way. I thought Reptile in MK1 was the coolest because he had the powers of both ninjas,
Scorpion and Sub-Zero, all in one guy.
And like double movement speed. And I was like, man, I want to play him. And you could never do that. And then all these ROM hacks make it possible. And I felt that I've played a bunch, but MK Arcade Perfect for Genesis by the lead programmer is Master Lin Kuei.
Yep.
It felt arcade perfect. All you did was press a button on your controller to switch between Sub-Zero and Scorpion special moves, and I was like, this is what I've always wanted to do. It only took me, almost 30 years to get it, but it was still satisfying.
He nailed it, and he nailed it.
Yeah.
All right, so in your book, you talk about some of the tension between Sega of America versus Sega of Japan. On this live stream, you talked about the same thing between Microsoft of the US and Microsoft of Japan. I want to take it back to the Japanese Super Nintendo port of MK2 with the green blood. Do you know anything about what kind of tension, if any, there was between Nintendo of America and Nintendo of Japan when it came to that port?
There really wasn't any that I know of. I don't know for sure, but the thing is, Nintendo of Japan is actually Nintendo Company Limited. It's Nintendo headquarters. Nintendo of America largely does what Nintendo Company Limited or NCL tells them to do. That's where Shigeru Miyamoto works, etc. So they probably there's stricter content laws in some countries. There are a lot of games still banned in Germany, specifically any showing Nazi iconography, because it's still very sensitive there and always will be. And Japan just had, I believe, stricter violence laws. And so that was, Nintendo said, all right, we'll release this game elsewhere in territories like the States, and it can have all the blood if that's what people want, because we don't want to get our ass kicked at market by Sega again. But in Japan, we're going to lock this down. We're going to have green blood. Yeah. We're going to, the fatalities will go black and white, which, it was silly. But again, that just made later releases of Mortal Kombat 2 all the more attractive. Because
it also somehow seems classy. I can't quite put my finger on it. There's something classy about it.
It's weird because it's still censorship, but it's also like a filter, and it's kind of stylized, like you're watching a black and white. Kill Bill Volume 1 did that, right? With when the bride was killing all the ninjas, it eventually went black and white because there was just so much blood, but it also had a certain style to it. So I know what you mean.
Yep. All right. Let me jump ahead now to MK3. I know you know this one. There's a menu called Scott Stuff. All right. For years, before I ask you, for years, my friend Scott Howell, the owner of co-owner of MortalKombatOnline.com, formerly MK5.org, we used to joke, oh yeah, they named it after you, Scott. But okay, maybe you can clear this up once and for all. Who is this really? Who is this Scott Stuff named after?
So I'm looking it up right now because I want to make sure I have his name handy.
Yeah.
At Sculptured Software, there's a programmer named Scott Paris. Sculptured Software was kind of loose with their programming titles. They like to have fun. If you look in the manual, Scott Paris was credited as super duper deluxe programming dude.
Yeah, I remember that they did funny titles like that. Yes.
Yeah, so that was Scott, and he was the one in charge of putting in cheat menus. So I'm actually lining up interviews with him, but Jeff Peters, who was the project manager for this version, or as he was known in the manual, the very tired project dictator type, Scott said, okay, I'm going to call this one cool stuff. I'm going to call this one cooler stuff. And this will be Scott stuff. Maybe he didn't want to do coolest. I don't know. But when I talk to him, I do want to ask, like, hey, why'd you call this Scott stuff instead of one of the other ones? And how did you decide which to put in there? For all I know, maybe the options in the Scott stuff, the cheats, are his favorite cheats, the ones he liked the most. So, but I can tell you, and Jeff Peters confirmed this, it was Scott Paris who named those menus.
Scott Paris. That's where Scott stuff comes from, ladies and gentlemen.
That's right.
All right. Jasper was asking me about something that I've actually talked to you in private about before. At CES, they had this like wrap with their different games coming out, including Mortal Kombat 2. You know some of the Acclaim folks, and they were very good at marketing, obviously. That was one thing that I think the fans would really get a kick out of if we can hear that rap song again. Can you track down that tape?
I am working on that now. I'm tracking down a few tapes for you.
I'll make you a deal. I can capture any tape to the PC, and I can share it with the community. If you get it for me, I'm just going to dump it and say, here it is, everybody. David Craddock got this for us. Support him and buy his book.
That sounds like a good deal for me. Like I told you offline, any of this stuff I find, I'd love a copy for myself, but then I want you to have originals because I love the MK community. I love all the collectors, and I know that would be kind of a crown jewel in your collection. So I'm working on it. I hope to have good news for you soon.
Okay. MK3, MK Trilogy question.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Since you're a programmer, maybe you can shed some additional insight on this one off the top of your head. Maybe not. Why is the music running at such a different pace on MK Trilogy and MK3? Like, it really screws up the whole, like, the tempo is different.
Yeah, that one I don't have the answer to yet, but I'm working on getting it.
Okay, yeah, maybe somebody at Avalanche. I don't know. It's just weird to me because the music goes at such a different pace and the sound effects and everything that now you've got people still screaming long after their body has been completely separated. You can still hear the screams afterwards. Which you didn't have that in MK3, but and not even on MK3 on PlayStation and DOS and all those ports, but with MK Trilogy you do. Like, the timing got screwed up somehow.
Yeah, no, that would be really interesting. A lot of times that does have to do, I'll make an educated guess. A lot of consoles only have a certain number of sound channels, and so the programmer might have felt that other sound channels needed priority or had lesser priority, so the screams would go longer or maybe get cut off at a certain point. But like I said, that's an educated guess, and I'm going to work on tracking down an official answer.
Okay, yeah, I would love to find out about that. Like, this, there's just certain little mysteries about MK that have always bugged us, like in the back of our minds. And I feel like, again, I know I've said this before, but you're uniquely qualified with your connections and with your experience and your background. You're the guy that can kind of go and find all this stuff out for us and then put it in the book.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that. I know exactly what you mean. I know you and I have talked about this, but to a lot of people, when they think of Mortal Kombat, they think of blood and gore and fatalities. But when I think of Mortal Kombat, I think of mysteries. I think of secret characters. I think of secret modes. And these are just, I think that Ed Boon and John Tobias kind of conditioned us early on to want to chase mysteries in this franchise. And it's a lot of fun, honestly.
Right. I bet even they're surprised at the lengths that some of the people in the fan community will go to get to the bottom of this stuff.
I'm sure they are. Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay. I think you've explained this to me before, but just so that everybody else can kind of be on the same page. Windows was already starting to become popular. Windows 3.1 was certainly out by the time of MK1. Windows 95 was out by the time of MK2. Eventually, by MK3, right, when it was no longer in Acclaim's hands, they started doing a Windows and a DOS port, which just blew my mind. Like, wow, you're going to do both? But for MK1 and 2 specifically, they said, no Windows, we're not doing Windows, we're going to stick to DOS. You're a big PC gamer, so maybe you can kind of share some experience with that and why that would be the case.
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, I wrote a lot about Microsoft's history in gaming for Shack News under the long reads there. It's called Bet on Black, how Microsoft and Xbox changed popular culture. And the deal was this. You can think of DOS and Windows as platforms because they kind of were. They just both happened to exist on the PC. DOS wasn't really the best environment for games, but as we discussed earlier, as programmers used it and got more experience, they just kind of mastered it. But there were still things that bugged them. For example, long before plug and play, you had to make sure your game supported all sorts of different sound cards, different memory configurations, different peripherals. That's why, the keyboard, you can think of that as sort of the default controller. Every PC game, even games like Dark Souls, yeah, you can play them with a controller, but they also have to work with the keyboard because every PC gamer has a keyboard. It comes with your computer. You have to have one. So when Windows 95 came out, there was actually a lot of pushback from gaming publishers because Windows 3.1 was not popular for games. It was a resource hog. In fact, Windows 3.1 was not a separate operating system. It was just a graphical environment for DOS. The problem was Windows hogged a lot of resources. It took a lot of memory. So you could play some DOS games under Windows, but they might not run correctly or might not run well under Windows. And so for the longest time, game publishers just kept supporting DOS because it was a pain in the ass, but it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't.
I remember those days of having to exit Windows in order to properly play the DOS game. That was crazy.
Yeah, and Windows had more compatibility with different sorts of hardware, which is why you did see Windows 3.1 only games such as Myst. It just wouldn't have been the same in DOS, but those were the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
Fast forward a few years to 1994, 1995. There were some renegades within Microsoft, two in particular, Alex St. John and Seamus Blackley. Seamus Blackley is known as the father of the Xbox, and he really kind of took the torch that Alex St. John and his group of friends lit. Alex St. John came from the publishing industry where Mac was dominant, and he had this big personality, and he was able to, Bill Gates hired him to be an evangelist for publishing on PC with Windows, and Alex St. John made a ton of inroads that no one else has made in that business. Well, Alex St. John also had an interest in games. He knew why, he was a programmer himself to a degree, so he could understand why game publishers did not like Windows. And there was, Windows 95 came out in August 95, but originally it didn't have a lot of support for games. But Alex St. John and his group of 3 friends, they said, well, what if there was a suite of programming tools that made hardware plug and play? In other words, game developers said, okay, you can use a controller, but I don't have to worry about which gamepad, because this thing they created, this API, application programming interface called DirectX, was basically a translator. DirectX would look at the game and say, oh, you have a controller. Don't worry about which one it is. It's just a controller. Here's how many buttons it has. Oh, you have this graphics card. Don't worry about which one it is. I'll handle that.
That made it much easier for developers, and then as a result, Windows 95 games started to proliferate.
That's right. But it took a really big game to make the whole gaming industry sit up and pay attention. The game was Doom, which was still a big name in 1995. Quake was not out yet. Doom and Doom 2 were still considered the best first-person shooters and arguably the best PC games of all time at that time. So Alex St. John approached id Software and he said, hey, John Carmack, I know you're busy with the Quake engine, but I want to port Doom to Windows 95. If you give me the source code, I'll get it working. You don't have to do anything. And John Carmack said, okay, I don't have to do anything. That sounds good. Well, that gave rise to Doom 95. And again, Doom was a huge game in the industry. And Microsoft actually threw a big party for the launch of Doom 95 in DirectX. It was pretty wild. Bill Gates even appeared in a video. They kind of put him in the Doom corridor where he shot an imp with a shotgun and said in the worst acting ever, wow, these games are getting really realistic. It was hilarious. You can find that on YouTube. You should go check it out. But the whole PC gaming industry said, oh, wow, Doom's on Windows. And not only is it on Windows, it runs better than DOS. Higher resolution, graphical interface, so it's easy for players to load things like mods, which are custom-made levels. We're going to get in on this. The next big game, I believe, and I wrote about this as well, was Diablo. Blizzard North, which was the development studio that made Diablo, said, oh, DirectX, this looks cool. Again, Dave Brevik, much like John Carmack, was a kind of a programmer's programmer, and he said, I want to support DirectX. So Diablo was a Windows 95 only game made possible through DirectX. So as to why there were not ports of older Mortal Kombat games.
Yeah, this was before all that went down.
before all that went down, it just didn't make sense to go back and spend money to port those games to Windows 95. But Mortal Kombat 3 on PC was an exception. Just as Mortal Kombat 3 came out on 16-bit consoles and the PlayStation.
A little bit of self-cannibalization there.
A little bit, but you also had to support. I mean, if you look at it, the publisher looks at the user base and says, you know what? A lot more people have 16-bit consoles because they've been out longer. Of course, they've sold more. We still want to corner that market. So that's why MK3 was released for DOS, which a lot of people still used, and for Windows 95, because that had gained enough traction to attract PC publishers. So that's a long answer, but it's a really interesting one to me, and that's how that happened.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. I love all the background information about what's going on in the PC market and with Microsoft and the APIs. And if you know all that, then it makes sense why it took the developers had to be convinced that Windows was worth developing for. So thank you for that. Let's see. There's one more thing I think I really wanted to cover with you, and that is that again, going back to EGM, they have all the coolest screenshots. MK3 had a prototype where the graveyard was in it for the Super Nintendo, and of course the graveyard wasn't in the final release, but they had done all this work, like resizing the graphics and making it work and actually loading everything, and then they had to take it out. I'm sure you're probably going to say it was because they ran out of space on the cartridge, but what happened with that?
It was because they ran out of space, but the process of elimination is what's fascinating. Why that stage?
Yeah.
And I think it's because So one story I recount in the book, when I talked to some folks from Avalanche, I said, hey, why'd you cut Shiva from the 16-bit versions of UMK3?
I remember in your book when you explained it, and oh my god, it made so much sense. I better let you explain it.
Well, like it's kind of like solving a puzzle in the game that has you stumped, but then the solution is like, oh, that's so obvious. How did I not think of that? But Shiva was the most complex character sprite. She was the tallest, she was the widest, she was the most complex because she had 4 arms. And in the arcade, remember, she had unique sound effects for her screams and her grunts and groans. And so really it was just like, well, it just makes sense to take her out. It had nothing to do with popularity. If Nightwolf would have been the biggest character sprite in terms of storage space, he would have been ripped out instead of Shiva. The graveyard, I haven't gotten to this specifically, but I imagine it was the same thing. The graveyard was one of the most ornate backgrounds, but a lot of it, again, this decision probably came down to John and Ed, and they were thinking like, well, of all the backgrounds, like, we really like the cathedral, we love the soul chamber, that's still popular to this day, but we can take the graveyard out, because the graveyard, it's one of my favorite stages. It has a ton of atmosphere, but it also didn't have as much functionality. For example, you wouldn't want to cut out the bell tower because that's a pit level. There's more to do in that stage than there is in the graveyard. So it was probably just a process of elimination of, hey, the graveyard looks cool, but so do a lot of these other stages, and there's no pit fatality tied to it, so we'll just cut it.
Yeah, I could kind of see it. I really liked it the way the tombstones were kind of randomized. I liked the way they updated it for different ports, to revise the years, and they did all kinds of cool stuff with that stage. It is a shame that out of all the ones they had to cut, it was that one.
I know, it's one of my favorite stages, also because there's a lot of inside jokes. You had, Vogel and Johnny Cage's tombstones back there.
Yep.
It's really like, it upset me because, like you and a lot of fans, I'm into the lore, and I'm like, oh man, that kind of, you cut out the hint of what happened to Johnny Cage. Of course, he came back in Trilogy anyway, but it was still kind of a cool little thing because, fans love to scrutinize all the details of these levels to find out. I mean, it's just like ever since Mortal Kombat 2, you get to Shao Kahn's arena, you scroll a bit in either direction, and you see 2 very familiar faces held captive. And you're like, oh, that's what happened to them. That was a cool thing,
Of course. All right, things are winding down. There's just 2 questions that dying to ask you. All right. I know you've seen a lot of cool Mortal Kombat merch. I know you've been in a lot of talks with like the guys from the licensing group and stuff. Was there any Mortal Kombat merch that they just had to turn down? They said, no, that's too extreme. We can't do it.
Not to my knowledge, but I do know that, like we discussed earlier, sometimes, the licensing group with Danny Simon or other groups could kind of go over John and Ed's head to Neil Nacasta or Ken Fedesna to get permission. And, when the bottom line was money, they did it. John and Ed did not like the the first line of Mortal Kombat figures because they were really just recycled GI Joe figures. They didn't really resemble their characters at all. So there were probably some items that they considered too extreme, but for a licensing company to pass up an opportunity to make money, they would have had to be very extreme. Of course, sometimes things are just in bad taste. I don't know if you remember. This would have been about 10 years ago or so. There was a game called Dead Island, kind of a first-person zombie survival horror game. And in the collector's edition, you got this bust of like a woman from the neck down. She had large breasts, and it was just kind of like, this is gross. This is just dumb. So sometimes those extreme decisions, some immature marketer somewhere says, "Oh, this is so cool," but then it backfires because the public's like, "Okay,
right,
I didn't know there was a line, but you just crossed it. This is disgusting." And so, that sort of thing.
Well, I was thinking with MKX and even MK11, they started releasing like alcoholic beverages and stuff like that, which it's fine now, but in the 90s, considering the target audience, I don't think that would fly at all.
Well, you have to. Yeah, so that's really fascinating. I'm glad you brought that up because it's interesting how not only does time just go so fast, but cultural norms and what's accepted changes. Remember Looney Tunes cartoons, you had characters smoking cigarettes.
Yeah.
And a lot of
you've got Porky Pig using the B word.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that clip.
I have not, but I can believe it. And that's just because, back then before people could really get the tobacco companies to admit that, yeah, okay, these things are basically death sticks. It was just acceptable. And that's one reason why Looney Tunes, it's difficult to get them broadcast today because there's just a lot of objectionable content. You can go on a lot of networks, like the Disney Plus channel. A lot of times they'll have disclaimers before, like, hey,
back in this time it was considered okay.
Yeah, this was a product of its time. This does not reflect our current views, because really they don't care. They just have to cover their asses finally. But
I mean, obviously the people working there today probably wouldn't have signed off on it, but it's already been created. So what are you going to do?
And that's the thing. So I'm against censorship in any form, because I think it's not that I want to release objectionable content, but I believe that by doing things like taking Looney Tunes off the air, you're really kind of trying to redact or erase pieces of history, and I'm totally against that. I think that
I like to be able to look back and see where did we stand as a society and what kind of things were people exposed to, and it enhances our understanding of where we are and where we're going.
It's exactly. I mean, there's that saying: "Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Well, how can we learn from history if you're trying to expunge it?
Yeah, it shouldn't be erased.
So, yeah.
Okay, and then your book, Mortal Kombat 4. It's kind of cheating, but it's still technically the arcade era, but it also kind of goes into the 3D era a little bit. I know you're doing a trilogy. I know the first one is really the arcade rounds, and 3D era is next, and NetherRealm area is final. Can you answer any questions about MK4 and MK Gold?
I can answer. So I didn't get into the home versions of MK4 because, again, I was out of time. My deadline was a little different last year when I finished the first draft. And also Mortal Kombat Gold. That's something that I knew. The home versions of MK4, they are historically significant because to this day, unless I'm wrong, Mortal Kombat 4's arcade ROM has not been emulated perfectly.
Right.
And so the versions of Mortal Kombat 4 that most people are familiar with are either MK4 on PlayStation, N64, or PC, or Mortal Kombat Gold. And I felt like I didn't want to do those versions a disservice by just kind of glossing over them. I want to really go into the weeds and really dig up and see what we can find. And so I can't answer anything now, but rest assured, things like Baylock and other considerations about what it was like to work with Eurocom, that stuff is on deck for Long Live MK Round 2.
Yeah, tons of people are asking about Baylock. Everybody wants to know about him. I've got a couple of screenshots of him right now on the screen for you to look at. Basically, look, from my understanding, Eurocom put him in the game, and then Midway said, we didn't actually approve of this. You just kind of did it without clearing it, so you need to take him out. But they had just gone through something with MK4. Katana was actually in the game, and they had to take Katana out, but with a Game Shark, you could unlock her. So they were like, this time, you're not going to leave any traces of him in the code. He needs to be wiped out completely. But as far as I understand, there is a beta version or prototype version of the MK Gold disc that was sent to the offices of Game Informer. So they had the disc, they ran it in their offices, they captured those screenshots. I don't know how, if you have contacts with people at Game Informer or Eurocom, but if anybody could get to the bottom of this and find out, get us a playable version of MK Gold where you can play as Belloc, you're the guy. No pressure.
Yeah, I'd love to see
no pressure, but you're the guy.
No pressure. That's, Mortal Kombat 4 is such an interesting game. I know I'm in the minority here. It was actually my favorite Mortal Kombat from the arcade era. I really liked the return to kind of a darker atmosphere from MK3, which I thought mechanically it's really awesome, but tonally it's fucking ridiculous. Even though I love that game again. But Mortal Kombat 4 also, you had Noob Saibot in the original roster. There's so many moving parts to that. I mean,
I was there for the MK4 Road Tour. I was there when the trailer for the game dropped online on the internet. Yeah. Like, I remember seeing the same screenshots from the trailer posted in a magazine later and thinking, oh, well, magazines are kind of on their way out then because the internet's way better.
Yeah, that's right. I recounted that story you told me in Long Live MK. And Mortal Kombat 4 is something I want to continue exploring because I actually have a question for you. So I have to run in about 5 minutes. Yep. But I've been wanting to ask you this. You have a Mortal Kombat arcade machine. I believe your wife got it for you.
Yep.
That has MK1, 2, 3, UMK3, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, and Mortal Kombat 4. I wondered which versions of MK4 you run in that cabinet.
It is the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 4, and it's run imperfectly.
How are you? Oh, wow. See, what program are you using?
It's MAME.
It's MAME. So see, that's what I meant. The last I looked, MAME was still struggling with MK4 perfect emulation.
They are struggling. They are struggling. It's missing a few spots, I guess, is the best way to put it. It's playable, but graphically, it's not quite there. And my understanding is that the Zeus hardware, all the manuals, all the documentation for it were lost when Midway closed down, and they started just throwing everything in the trash. And eventually, some efforts were taken to preserve some of this stuff. But there was a lot of cool stuff in the Midway building. Zeus documentation among it, from what I understand, but I don't know if you ever saw this. They had like a bunch of clocks on the office showing like time zones from different areas. Like they were in Chicago, obviously, so it started with Chicago time, but they had New York, Tokyo, Paris, Outworld, and the numbers were all backwards and the clock went the wrong way. It was so cool.
That is pretty cool. I was going to say I've seen something like that. I wrote for IGN briefly, and in the main corridor they had clocks with every time zone in the world. No Outworld though, so we were missing that.
It's a very old school way of doing things. You'd see this all the time back I remember seeing this in like the Mary Tyler Moore show, like in the newsroom. They just had clocks from all over. Obviously with the smartphone, you don't need that. All you have to just do is, hey, what time is it in Turkey or what time is it in London? And you'll find out. Yeah,
that's really cool. I just saw How's Your Father? I love that name, by the way. Asks, is there an MK4 arcade 1-up? It's funny. Maybe that's something I can ask them. I do know that it's possible it could happen because they're starting to move into Midway's 3D games, such as I believe NFL Blitz. But the funny thing, I was thinking, Arcade 1-up doesn't do one-offs. They like to release at least 2 or 3 games per cabinet.
True.
And I was thinking, man, it would just be like a monkey's paw curling situation for them to give us Mortal Kombat 4 with War Gods or something.
I mean, they could sneak in MK Gold, possibly. I don't know how they would do it. Somebody would have to optimize the code there, but hey,
the irony is that there's a Dreamcast emulator I use. Mortal Kombat Gold is emulated perfectly. That's how I play MK Gold these days.
It's great.
Is that emulate?
Probably null DC, right?
I think it is. I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's it.
Yeah, you know what? I'll have to get with you later in private about this, but there's a setting where you can do like a widescreen hack and it'll show you the whole background. Like instead of cutting off the sides, it'll actually render that part out and show it to you in 16:9. It's amazing some of the stuff that you can do with the Dreamcast emulator.
Yeah, that's cool. We'll have to dig into that. I'd love to do that.
Emulators in general, the stuff that the things that you can do, the tweaks you can do on the games, the ROM hacks, like you said earlier, it's amazing stuff. So I know you've got to run. I know you've got to talk to Arcade 1-up. You're probably going to ask them about MK4. about the Zeus documentation. Maybe you can confirm with them that happened. I know you're going to ask them about the Supreme MK2. There's probably a few other things that you're going to ask them about. I bet they'll probably hook you up with the free arcade 1-up machine.
We'll see. We'll see. The funny thing is, I bought their MK2 like midway anniversary or whatever it is, but you know, I have a lot of questions related to the design of the Mortal Kombat anniversary cabinet they're putting out. I know that the big thing is, hey, where's Dan Pacina? So that's something I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I'd like to talk to him about it. So we'll see what I can uncover.
That's something. That's a conversation you got to have. So I'm going to pull up a link to your website so everybody knows. It's longlivemortalkombat.com. All you have to do, guys, put your email address here. You get access to the newsletter. I just got one this morning where he interviewed Diamond Select Toys. Every so often, he's going to be interviewing more people, either on the development side or on some merch or maybe from the community. It's just a grab bag. You never know what you're going to get. So go to longlivemortalkombat.com, sign up for the newsletter. There's a link to the Kickstarter. Tell us again about the Kickstarter. When is that going live?
That will go live on Tuesday, March 22nd, just under a month from now. There'll be different editions of Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1. There'll be bundles. You'll be able to get cool stuff as a physical book. So definitely check out longlivemortalkombat.com. You can follow me on Twitter at David L. Craddock. And just recently, I started a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Long Live Mortal Kombat if you prefer Facebook over Twitter. But, you know, that website, that's your one-stop shop to get to all those places.
All right. Yes, definitely. Update the site and put a link to your Facebook group on there. David, thank you so much for doing the interview. Thank you for giving me a sneak peek at your book. I'm excited about everything you got going on, and really appreciate your time today.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you, and long live Mortal Kombat.
Long live Mortal Kombat. Take it easy, guys.
All right.
Whew. Okay.